đắt lường. Please welcome Venerable Người Hải. I have the honor to present to you Venerable Người Hải, who will give us a talk about Bodhisattva tradition. Please welcome.
Nam mô just a minute to get set up, and then we'll get started. Okay, so as announced, again, my name is Người Hải. I'll be speaking about the Bodhisattva tradition today. So I'll be speaking briefly about some examples of Bodhisattvas, human people in the modern era who have been Bodhisattvas. But just briefly about that, and then mostly I'll be discussing how one becomes a Bodhisattva. What does it mean to be a Bodhisattva, and how do we become Bodhisattvas? Because that's the whole point of the Dharma. The whole point of our study and practice of the Buddha's teachings is for us to become Bodhisattvas and ultimately Buddhas. It's not just a hobby or an intellectual exercise. Our whole purpose, in fact, our whole purpose for being is to become enlightened. People ask often, well, what's the meaning of life? This is kind of a stereotypical question that people ask. I would actually rephrase it slightly and say, what is the purpose of our being alive? And it is simply to grow in compassion and wisdom so that we can truly be of benefit to other beings. That's why we're here. Sometimes we feel lost in our lives. We don't know why we're here. And of course, we all have our own particular individual purpose. Some of us become monks and nuns. Some of us become doctors or teachers, or we start a business. So we all have our own particular activities that we engage in our lifetime. But if we look at the big picture, the meaning of our being is to become enlightened. So I'll be talking about the path to enlightenment today, basically, giving an introduction to that. So I'll be speaking for a while. I'm not sure how long the talk will last exactly, but I'm sure there will be time for questions at the end. So if you think of a question while I'm speaking, please make a note so you don't forget. I make this mistake all the time. I go to Dharma teachings, and I think of really great questions while the teacher is speaking, and then when it's time for question and answer, I can't remember what I wanted to ask. Sometimes then I remember on the drive on the way home, and I get a little frustrated. So, now Venerable Vinli asked me to talk about some bodhisattvas, some living bodhisattvas or modern bodhisattvas. A couple of them are no longer with us, from the Vietnamese tradition. I'm sure that you know more about them than I do. And also, there's not a whole lot of information on them in English, unfortunately. me. I wish that there was more, because they seem to be very, very dedicated practitioners and really excellent bodhisattvas. I wish that we had more information on them in English. But since I'm sure you know more of their stories than I do, I'll only briefly mention them here. And the first one was Venerable Duk. I'm sure you all know his name. He is the monk who immolated himself, who burned himself in 1963 in Vietnam. He was originally born in 1897, and he became interested in the Dharma as a young boy. He started studying, I think he started studying under his uncle at around the age of 7, but he became a novice monk, Shamanera, at the age of 15. And then he became a fully ordained monk at the age of 20. So he had a very long history with the Dharma, and he started very young. And then after his ordination, he went into retreat for 3 years up in the mountains by himself. But following his retreat, he came back into the world and he built many temples. I think it was well over 30 temples that he built throughout Vietnam. He also studied texts from the Theravada tradition in Cambodia for a couple of years. And then he served in various leadership positions in the Vietnamese Mahayana Sangha, the Mahayana monastic community, such as overseeing monks in his own province. So he started taking on leadership roles when he was still fairly young. So protesting the Diem administration's discrimination against Buddhists, which comprised between 70 and 90% of the population at that time, got him and a lot of other monks in a whole lot of trouble. Some of you, I'm sure, who were born and raised in Vietnam remember the oppression of Buddhists at that time. Diem, in fact, once told one of his military officers, Diem himself was Catholic and really wanted to promote Catholics within the military. And so he told one of his military officers, forgetting that this officer was Buddhist, he said, well, you should promote Catholics because they're the only ones who can be trusted. So he had a really negative view of Buddhists. And then a lot of people in the military, seeing that if you were Catholic, you could get promoted. A lot of people in the military converted for that reason. A lot of the officers. And then they also saw people who refused to convert were denied promotions. And then there were also some Catholic priests in the country at the time who had their own private armies. There was also some forced conversion and looting and destruction of pagodas and temples in some areas that was completely ignored by the authorities. Again, some of you may remember some of this. And then there were some villages, entire villages, that were Buddhists that decided to convert. Everyone converted at once to Catholicism because they saw that they could get more resources and help from the government if they, at least on the surface, appeared to convert to Catholicism. And also at public events, Diem had the Catholic flag flown, and he also dedicated Vietnam to the Virgin Mary, who was the mother of Jesus at one point. So you can see the discrimination that Buddhists were starting to face under his administration. And then the final straw seemed to be that his government, Diem's government, refused to allow Buddhists to fly the Buddhist flag for the Buddha's birthday. And so then there were protests, there were marches. And then Diem had his security forces fire into the crowd and they killed 9 people. But then he refused to take responsibility for that. He tried to blame the Viet Cong for that attack. So there were protests after this, and then Venerable Thich Quang Duc decided to martyr himself. He decided to burn himself to protest the oppression of Buddhists in Vietnam. So on that day, he first participated in a demonstration against the policies of the Diem regime, marching with some Buddhists before getting in a car and driving to an intersection that I think was outside the Cambodian embassy. That's correct? Okay.
Yes.
Maybe some of you should be giving part of this lecture, I think. I think you know all of this more than I do. So then he sat down at this intersection, and I think it was his driver or someone else who was with him took out a gas tank, a container of gas from the car, and poured it over him. And he was sitting chanting for a while before he lit the match that lit him on fire. Now he had told, or some people had told, some of the foreign press in particular, that there was going to be an incident the next day, that they should come. But there were a lot of protests and marches against the Diem regime happening at that time, and so a lot of the foreign press just didn't show up. They didn't think anything big was going to happen. In fact, some who did show up, they didn't bring their cameras or anything. They just thought it was going to be nothing. They didn't know what was going to happen. And then, of course, the images that were taken, though, Venerable Taekwondo, while he was burning, are world famous. This had a huge impact. The Diem regime then, responding to this, said, okay, well, we're going to make reforms, but either those reforms were not implemented or they were only done halfway and very slowly. And also, when I was researching this, I came across a video of Diem's wife. You can find it on YouTube. It's a black and white video of her describing his martyrdom as a barbecue. She said, all they managed to do was barbecue one of their monks. I didn't know the history of this, actually. And when I saw that, my jaw hit the floor. I could not believe that she said this openly on the international stage. But she said it. So I think this demonstrates the depth of indifference and the profound discrimination that Buddhists were facing in Vietnam at the time. Even today, actually, this continues. So he left a letter, actually, and there was an interesting quote that I found. Before closing my eyes and moving towards the vision of the Buddha, I respectfully plead to President Ngo Dinh Diem to take a mind of compassion towards the people of the nation and implement religious equality to maintain the strength of the homeland eternally. I call the venerables, reverends, members of the Sangha, and the lay Buddhists to organize in solidarity to make sacrifices to protect Buddhism. So he gave his life for the Dharma. Ultimately what happened is there were more attacks on Buddhist temples, and I don't know what happened to his heart, but so after Venerable Taekwondo, he burned himself, then he was re-cremated, he was properly cremated, but his heart didn't burn. His heart remained intact.